was invited to come to Western Michigan University, I found myself as the only geologist amongst 7 geographers. And so the Department of Geography and Geology was the beginning for me. Much took place. My role, I felt I had to sell geology, not only to the community, but also to our profession and also to other people within the university. And so the competition was always there for students. We started with the general education program, making sure our courses in geology were accepted as part of the general education. And then we expanded from that point, and it seemed logical because of our teacher education background at this institution that we focus on an earth science program for teachers in our department. And after 3 or 4 years, we were able to get an earth science major. We had added faculty members. Dr. Richard McGee was the first geologist to come to Western. He was followed by Dr. W. David Kinsey, McGee was mineralogy and hard rock. David Kinsey was a paleontologist and a stratigrapher. So we were growing with the support of George Mallinson, who was Dean of the Graduate College at Western. He was a scientist in teacher education, and he knew the need for a full-blown program in geology and was very supportive. And a major step that took place was he supported us in the application for National Science Foundation Institutes, summer institutes, which we were able to obtain. Well, the funding for those programs was approximately $37,000 per year. And that was a major attention gatherer for the administration. Funding for that kind of program was unusual. And George and I, and finally the provost, recognized that an independent geology department was much more able to seek out funds for programs not only in teacher education but also in research. And so that was the crux of why geology was separated from the Department of Geography and Geology. And that took place on July 1st, 1965. I think a lot of what has happened in more recent years is a result of the work that has been done by the Advisory Council in the department. And this was an endeavor that I and the faculty undertook because we saw a lot of merit in its potential. We were able to get the state geologist on board the council. We were able to get alumni from our department and some local business leaders in the community and other representatives in the mining and in the petroleum and refining industries, so that these were essential members that contribute in the advisory capacity, helping the department resolve issues, making contacts in industry and business for student applications, and also to make contacts for them to come and recruit in our student area. And so we went on to create that advisory council, and I'm pleased to report it's in active existence today. And so I regarded that as a major accomplishment. Many of these members on the council have been very influential in helping us. In 1973, I started a field trip to the Grand Canyon after having participated in the National Science Foundation trip down the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon. These trips, I think, went on for a number of years. My recollection is I think I did a total of 18, and many of the people still report to me about that was the one experience in their lifetime they'll never forget.
looking back at the history of the department, you can't help but notice the relationship between the evolution of the department, if you will, evolution of the programs in the department, and national trends. There would never have been the innovative kind of education that NSF-sponsored groups brought to it, and it initiated an entirely new way of teaching earth science in the country, and a great response, if you will, to Sputnik. What OPEC did to the United States caused us to re-examine our position in energy. So OPEC, in a sense, did us a favor because it caused us to re-examine the curriculum. The new programs complemented the old programs because the students who came in to take hydro classes were also taking geology classes. And when the Environmental Protection Agency finally came to the point where, in essence, legislators said no more, that's enough, and passed Superfund, well, it produced what was necessary for groundwater contamination to be addressed, and that was money. It was industry's money that they were using, but it provided the funding which then produced the training that was necessary to address the groundwater contamination, the training that was necessary to clean it up for companies to either hire hydrogeologists or even to start new hydro companies. We consulted on, for example, the KL landfill and did the basic work on the KL landfill. Because of this national trend and the awareness of the need for groundwater protection, Michigan State was able to get their funding from Kellogg. Because prior to this, people weren't really that concerned about groundwater and groundwater contamination. But when it was exposed, it exploded. In fact, Michigan the governor then appointed a Michigan Environmental Review Board, of which I was a member. And the primary responsibility of that committee was to review environmental impact statements. And the environmental impact statements came out of the Superfund legislation. So geologists and hydrogeologists had a role in writing environmental impact statements. The environmental impact statement then became a critical part of this whole effort, and also produced jobs for earth scientists.
Good job.
I'm Tom Straw. I started out as a sedimentologist, stratigrapher, working for Big Oil, as it's called these days, and I joined the faculty at Western Michigan in September of 1968. Well, when I left Western, a person could get a degree in geology, earth science education. We had an earth science environmental program. We had a hydrogeology degree, and we had a master's in geology, a master's in earth science, and a PhD in geology with an emphasis in hydrogeology. I was a major player in the development of the hydrogeology program, but I worked closely with other members of the faculty, especially Lloyd Schmaltz and Nick Pissarro. Well, when we started building the program, we found that we really didn't have a good way to teach people how to be a practical, practicing hydrogeologist. There was an engineering firm, and they agreed to help us set up a hydrogeology field course. And they let one of their employees, Marek Zalewski, come and direct our field course for us. And we worked with him then to develop that. And then we developed that, and it went very well. It was very well received, and our students certainly gained an awful lot by it. And then we did it a number of times, and it seems it's still going on. And the way we got into an environmental emphasis in the department was Dick Pissarro had just come back from spending a sabbatical year with USGS, Palo Alto, California, and he came back really fired up to do environmental geology. He said perhaps a way we could convince the administration to fund us, because the environmental thing was very hot at that time, would be to convince them to fund us to have an environmental emphasis in the department. Well, Dick, Lloyd, and I worked to put together a proposal. It went very well. And part of the deal that we presented was that the department would prepare a book about the environmental geology of Kalamazoo County, and that this book is that book, Kalamazoo County, Geology and the Environment. And it was done in 1978. When it came out, Art Slaughter, who was then state geologist, called me and he says, "Tom, all I've got to say is you can do all the rest of the counties anytime you're ready." So we were very pleased with the reception of it. When we talked to the EPA, we took this along. Beginning of the 1979 school year, Dick Passero and Lloyd Schmaltz were preparing a presentation for the US EPA. They were going to fund a contract for some $350,000 to develop the geology of Michigan for groundwater injection, and were awarded that contract. And I think it changed all of our lives. The US EPA extended the contract a couple of times, and I believe that the total amount of the funding was over $700,000. We used most of that money to fund something over 20 students and help us with the work. And I always thought of it as getting double duty for the money, because we were having students go to school on the money we were bringing in, and they were learning it all at the same time. It was a very good time for us. It was a very exciting time.
I basically was hired to do maps, photographs, audiovisual aids, this sort of thing. And I just finished a master's degree in geography, but my emphasis was on geology. I don't know why they let me do that, but I took courses from Tom Straw, and he suggested that I apply for this position. And it sounded pretty good to me, so I did. What I did, and why they hired me, is that I had a background in cartography, photography, and various types of graphic arts. And that became the basis for my job. And I did that mostly, but over the years, whatever needed to be done around here, I did. The job description basically is what I can do. And this ranged from repairing equipment. I could repair some cameras and microscopes. And they hired a guy to come over and teach me how to do thin sections. You know, these are micro sections of rocks and minerals that you can look at it underneath the microscope. A lot of equipment repair. I try to keep the AV stuff together. You know, these days almost everything is on computers and digital, and in those days we had projectors that had bulbs that would burn out and worse. And when we turned digital, the first computer in the department was for the secretary. We had a dedicated word processor. That one was no longer suitable. They got one of the first PCs that had, I'm not sure whether it was running MS-DOS. It was probably running an older version of operating system. By default, I became the tech service, only because I was one of the only ones who actually owned a computer. I was one of the first people in the department, other than Bill Salk, the resident geophysicist, to actually own a computer. And so I kind of got comfortable with computers. So I was the one when somebody needed me to load some software or to put a new hard drive in or whatever, I would do that. When I got this job, being curator of the museum was kind of a pleasant surprise, because I knew there was a museum here, but I didn't know that I would be doing this. And again, probably because nobody else really wanted to do it, I did it. And it was fun because we had some very interesting specimens, some really spectacular stuff.
My name is William B. Harrison III, and I came to Western in 1973. Over the last 35 years or so, I've probably supervised about 50 master's students and a couple of PhD students as well. And I taught most of the sedimentary geology classes over those years. As we began to delve more into Michigan geology, I started developing relationships with some of the independent oil and gas companies that operated here in Michigan. We got core samples from the wells that were drilled. We started building a collection here of Michigan geology data. In the 1990s, we developed a partnership with a small company out of Traverse City called Cronus Development, and they were very interested in going back to some of the old fields that had been developed 50 and 60 years earlier, back in the 20s and 30s, that were by most people's standards thought to be depleted. But we felt that applying some new technology and really studying the geology of those fields might allow us to extract more oil and gas out of it. So in a joint research proposal between us and Michigan Tech University, we submitted a program to the Department of Energy to drill a test well using a relatively new technology at that time called horizontal drilling. We drilled that well in partnership with this company and collected all the data and samples from it. And when the well got down to the zone that had previously produced a lot of oil, it actually blew out and oil came to the surface. Everybody got so excited because that field had not produced hardly any oil for maybe 30 or 40 years. And that individual well has, since the late 1990s, produced over 100,000 barrels of additional oil. And within just a few months, there were dozens of additional oil wells that got drilled using that same technology, and it really kicked off a kind of a mini boom in what they call sort of secondary recovery or additional development, redevelopment of some of these old fields. And since that time, there's been hundreds and hundreds of additional horizontal wells drilled throughout the state of Michigan in all kinds of different formations. So it was a sort of a scientific activity that actually stimulated industrial activity. This building that we're sitting in is now a state repository as part of the Michigan Geological Survey. But about 30 years, a little over 30 years ago, I started contacting some of the oil and gas companies that were around the state that had been drilling these wells, and they were more than happy to give us any kind of help and information, and we developed many partnerships and lots of relationships between the private industry sector and our academic world. And these companies had warehouses full of samples from wells that they drilled, core samples, archives of this stuff all over the place. And it soon became obvious that there was a need to have a sort of statewide facility where this material could be collected and housed, kind of a library of the geology of Michigan. When we first started, I just had a few things, and our departmental chairman, Dr. Lloyd Schmaltz, found a small room, a laboratory in the geology building in Root Hall. And I soon was able to fill that up, and he found another space. We moved all that collection over into the basement of the second oldest building on campus. We at first just had one room in the basement of that building, and then we just kept getting more collections and expanded into the next room, and finally we occupied the whole basement level. And then we started asking for more space and got rooms on the first and second floor as well. By about 2001, we were really lucky because all the friends and relationships that we've developed in the oil and gas industry in Michigan, they worked with their colleagues, and in fact, instead of building a place, they found an existing industrial facility. It's about a 27,000 square foot facility that contains over 500,000 feet of core rock samples now, actual physical chips of drilled rock material from more than 25,000 wells, and geological information from pretty much every well that's ever been drilled in the state of Michigan. So we're really proud of it because people want to come all the time and study here. We use it in our teaching. We train young, new geology students using these materials, and then also the graduate level students will use it for their scientific research and their thesis material. And over the years, my students and I have written dozens and dozens of papers about Michigan geology and published them. and we've given hundreds of talks out there about Michigan geology. So I think now when most people talk about Michigan geology, they think of the research that we've done here and the kinds of resources that we have for people to come and look at things.
I'm Linda Harrison. I came to Western in 1973. I had a master's in micropaleontology, and I was hired to teach Dick Passero's courses while he was away on sabbatical. After that, I went into the insurance and financial planning industry, where I also learned about public relations because I wrote columns on financial planning, and I also spoke across the country for the insurance industry as a member of the $1 Million Roundtable. Some of those skills came in very handy when I came back to Western in 1993 to work at the Core Lab. Bill started that in 1983, and it's been our goal to collect all the cores, cuttings, and well records that are in Michigan. At that time, they were in many collections in universities and private industry, and you'd be hard-pressed to find out where anything was. So my role in all of that was to locate these collections, bring them to Western before they were sent to landfills, because many of them were at risk because they'd lost key personnel or funding, hire students to inventory them, get that information on the web, and help facilitate research by our faculty members. I also organized yearly workshops where we took that research information to industry, which, together with their expertise, helped them drill hundreds of oil and gas wells, producing more domestic energy and investing millions of dollars in Michigan's economy. Of course, we outgrew West Hall through all that growth, and then I had to raise funds to help build a new building and to help raise operating capital for that collection. Fortunately, we are in a new building now at McGree, and our collection now has 500,000 linear feet of core. And considering it cost industry $50 million to drill that core alone, it's a very valuable collection. Bill and Dave Barnes and Mike Grammer and other faculty members have done tremendous research here using those collections, and also taught our students, and industry comes here to do exploration. Our goal is to keep doing this because that information is raw data. It provides the answers to questions that your children will ask about our resources and our risks. And our challenge is to get funding, ongoing funding, so that we'll be able to continue to do this. That is the challenge we face in September 2015 as we celebrate our 50th anniversary.
Hi, I'm Ron Chase. I was a faculty member in this department for 39 years, starting in 1973, when I was hired in as an associate professor of geology, and ending in 2012 when I finally decided to retire. My teaching assignments in the department were largely originally in the areas of metrology and structural geology. I was relieved of the structural geology duties and glad to pass them off to a very wonderful structural geologist named Chris Schmidt, and continued with the petrology duties for the remainder of my career, and actually kind of got also eventually into the earth science teaching field toward the latter part of my career. In the process of these 39 years, I developed the structural analysis graduate class. I combined with Bill Salk and Chris Schmidt to develop the plate tectonics class, and I developed the geology major Upper Peninsula field course, thoroughly revamped the earth science teaching Upper Peninsula field course, and developed a slope stability analysis course. I was also graduate advisor from 1974 to 1989, at a time when the department developed their master's in geology, a second master's in geology, and developed the PhD programs. I was not the one developing these programs necessarily, but I was the one who was kind of running them through the administrative system. Later on, from roughly 1996 or so, when John Grace retired, until the time when Heather Petkovic was hired into the department, I was also the earth science teaching advisor. In terms of the research activities, I brought with me from my previous institution, the Colorado State University at Pueblo, a NSF grant, and then proceeded to get 4 more NSF grants, co-authored by other people, of course. And these dealt with Rocky Mountain tectonics in some way, shape, or form. In the mid-1990s, I saw fit to kind of change my focus a little bit and look at what you might call neotectonics, and started landslide studies along the Lake Michigan coast. In 1996, this began with a grant from the U.S. Army Research Office for 3 years. And then that grew eventually into a project that was sponsored for 12 years by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. The total expenditure of that project turned out to be roughly $1.9 million. And that has now all been written up and published. And with that particular last flourish of publications, my career ended and I retired. And the university has been extremely supportive. The faculty has been wonderful. I started out with a cadre of 8 in the department that were all on the same page and all very friendly. I watched the department through the years develop to a group of 15, but the camaraderie, the working together, the common cause that the department maintained never changed. I'm just very happy that I spent 39 years in this department, and I hope that others will continue well beyond that and be just as happy.
I was hired to teach geophysics and structural geology, but I also taught physical geology, which we called 130, and I also taught oceanography. I started in Montana on my field work during my PhD, and I continue it to the present day, so that covers quite a few years. I've written some papers, a lot of papers actually, with mostly with my graduate students on the geology of southwestern Montana. And in some respects, I'm the go-to guy on that region. But I've also worked in Argentina because it has a geology that's going on now, a modern geology that's very similar to what Montana was back in 65 million years ago or so. So I've worked with a bunch of Argentine geologists in a region called the Sierras Pampeanas there, which is like the Rocky Mountains here, but the difference is that they're active, as well as the Precordillera, which is an exotic terrain that was actually I helped to demonstrate that came from Laurentia, which is North America during the Ordovician. So it's probably my biggest contribution to tectonics was helping to show that connection between a good deal of Argentina and Chile are rafted in from what was then Laurentia, which is today North America, from the southern Appalachians. And I've worked more broadly in the Rocky Mountains. I have a couple of books that I edited, one with Ron Chase on the nature of the deformation in the Rocky Mountains from New Mexico all the way to Montana. Early on, I took my students to Baraboo, Wisconsin. I always loved that part of my job. Working with undergraduates in the field. And then we started going to the southern Appalachians. And no, it was all great fun.
Got a call from somebody here at the Institute for Water Sciences and offered me a position at that, which was not really part of the geoscience or geology department at the time, but very close, and we were housed in Root Hall. So I had a number of years there until that was closed, and then I was nicely folded into the geology department again. All this started in 1990 when I came back to Western for the second time. And been here continuously since then. During that time, I've taught a number of courses, starting from the Introductory Geology, Geology 1000, Geology for Majors 130 or 1300, the whole range of the geophysics courses, some of which I developed, entered geophysics, gravity and magnetic methods, seismic methods, electrical methods, and a ground penetrating radar course. And back in the early 90s, we also taught, we had enough enrollment for a field geophysics course in one of the summer sessions. See, I also taught a one semester course for the computer science department. And I participated in the hydro summer field course and actually directed it for a number of years, the entire course. But teaching the geophysics module, been involved in that most years that I've been here, either directly or secondarily if somebody else is leading it. With the Institute for Water Sciences, we were fortunate to get one major piece of capital equipment, which was the ground penetrating radar, which was fairly new at that time. In fact, this was the first digital GPR system out there, and we got that I think about 1992, and I've had that and kept it running ever since, in fact, with several upgrades. But our first big project, or series of projects, dealt with mapping the sand thickness offshore Lake Michigan, near shore, in the near shore portion. Early on, I realized, and I'd seen one or two of these before. Stanford had one, a small one on their campus, and we had all this land out at Asylum Lake, and I asked the Vice President Beam and Tim Kellogg, the finance person, if they would mind not leasing one parcel of land to the farmer. At that time, all that Asylum Lake property was being rented to farmers every year for cropping. To take out that portion north of this little drive going into the lake so that we could install some targets, geophysical targets underground there. They funded us to do a geophysical survey or test various geophysical methods to see if we could locate abandoned or lost water wells or monitoring wells. And then they took us up to Wirt Smith Air Force Base and tested us on 3 or 4 different sites there where they knew what was there. They knew there were some abandoned wells, and we were supposed to find them, which we generally did. In fact, we found a couple they didn't know about too. But, so that was a successful project.
I came because the department was developing a strong reputation in water-related research, and they had received a grant from the Department of Commerce called the Research Excellence Grant, and Dwayne Hampton and I came initially to work on that grant. One of the things that I realized we needed in the state was a better understanding of the surficial deposits, so I began to around 1995, do mapping of the surficial deposits through the U.S. Geological Survey, and that's continuing up to the present time. At University of North Dakota, I was teaching a course in physical geology for engineers, and there really was no good textbook for that, so I decided to write one, and the first edition of that was published just at the time I came here in 1986, and it's in its 3rd edition now. And also, while I was here in the 90s, I started to, I was teaching a hydrogeochemistry course here, groundwater quality, and I didn't feel there was a good applied book for that, so I, over a several year period, wrote that, and it was published around 2000, I believe. The chair prior to me was Tom Straw, and Tom went on sabbatical in 1995, and I became interim chair. Then Tom came back for 1 year and then retired. So I became chair after that for 2 terms, 6 more years. And that was a difficult time for the department because we had just had this Institute for Water Sciences, which was a very large initiative in the Office of the Vice President for Research. And because of some administrative difficulties in the university, this was transferred to Department of Geosciences with only partial funding to sustain it. And so that was difficult. And there were 3 staff members Bill Sock was one, R.V. Krishnamurthy was another, and a lab director in the water quality lab. And we had to accommodate those in the department. And R.V. had already moved in as a tenure track faculty member. And so one of my challenges was to try to bring Bill Sock into the department as a permanent position. At that point also, we had retirements of Dick Passero, Tom Straw, and one of the big events was that we were able to get the mineral collection that Jim Duncan Jr. Donated to the department, and with the support of the dean and provost, build new display cabinets in the lobby of Root Hall and expand the Lloyd Schmaltz Museum to accommodate this really world-class collection of minerals that Jim generously donated to us. We had some turnover in the office at that point, and one of the things I consider as my best achievements was hiring Kathy Wright, who is still our departmental secretary and has really made outstanding contributions to the department.
In 1986, I came to Western and was really attracted to the potential of working in a major sedimentary basin, the Michigan Basin, and the core repository facility, which was in its very beginnings, was also a very appealing opportunity. Also, coincidentally, despite the fact there was a bit of a downturn in industry, there was quite a little mini boomlet in terms of exploration in a sandstone unit here in Michigan. So I got involved in that in the middle 80s, and that was sort of the wave that I rode initially here. I guess my focus and interaction with students, especially upper-level undergraduate and graduate students, ended up being in applied geosciences. That is, trying to work with things that had some societal impact or importance. And the idea of relevance, which is certainly a common word used in academia, had a real significance for me, and that is that we could train students to actually go out and get employed and make use of their education. Besides worrying about training students to become professional geologists, I began to develop interests in, if you will, a little bit more sensitive, a little hotter issues, which were scientific influence on potential public policy decisions and water resource management issues, but that kind of evolved into coastal management things. So I spent a little bit of time running around on the beach and thinking a little bit about how science could inform both decision makers as well as the public in terms of how to most appropriately utilize, in this case, the resources that constitute our coastal environment. And some additional focuses, areas of interest in terms of public policy evolved sometime a little later in late 90s and in the aughts, 2000s, having to do with energy and the environment. Of course, energy has always been central to most of the applied geosciences that I've been interested in, but certainly the intensification of concerns about environmental issues, especially carbon dioxide emissions and the relationship between that issue and climate change and energy requirements, constituted an interesting, albeit complex, stew, if you will. And I began to change my thoughts about how a university educator ought to really be approaching their responsibilities. And I think that was a really important turning point in my teaching career, which was probably again about the early aughts. The idea that our responsibility was to use different approaches to training and teaching in the university to bring people in and push them through their education rather than trying to exclude them and weed them out. So that was pretty important. But the management of large data sets, using databases and producing maps that more effectively represent large data sets as opposed to kind of hand-picked or cherry-picked data sets became fairly obvious. So a lot of mapping techniques and the incorporation of geographic information systems into our curriculum in geosciences, and the application of those techniques, numerical analysis, spatial data analysis type techniques, into our subsurface geology program became very important. So we're in a position to not only benefit for our ability to work as local experts with the Michigan Basin and geological carbon sequestration and CO2 enhanced oil recovery activities, but also to train students to do work in the conventional energy industry. The techniques and approaches are quite similar. And it's been rewarding to be able to continue to train students to take advantage of a very hot job market here in the last 5-6 years in the energy industry, despite the fact that the sequestration initiative is really kind of stalled a little bit and other directions are being taken.
Some time ago, I tried to look at the research I've done and find a common thread, because I've done a lot of different things. I've looked at free product monitoring and recovery. I've looked at how do you deal with PCBs and contaminated lake and river sediments. I worked with Dr. Dan Cassidy on that. I've worked with Dr. David Barnes on carbon sequestration modeling. I also had a long-term project with several grad students on modeling contaminant transport. And the question on that was, can you actually model with predictive power contaminant transport using off-the-shelf models? And after I looked at all these different things that I'd done, including the work on PCBs in sediments, I determined that the common thread in my research was I wanted to know what was true. Do you have greater product or LNAPL thickness in a well than in an aquifer, and if so, what is the relationship? Can you model contaminant transport with off-the-shelf computer models that are used in industry? And the answer is yes, under limited circumstances, you can maintain predictive power. I recently turned in an abstract to a conference this fall for that same topic. I've always wanted to establish what is true and what is not. And so that has been my motivator, my driver. And I hope it's true that we can do carbon sequestration, because I think that's one of the ways that we're going to help ameliorate climate change, is by removing that amount of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So all of these things, it's not immediately obvious to the casual observer, but all of these things in my heart have that common thread of what is true, what can we actually do, what is myth.
I came to Western in 1991 as a research associate, at that time with the Institute for Water Sciences. At Caltech, I was, as well as during my graduate studies, I was involved in a lot of research using light element stable isotopes. And when I came to the Institute for Water Sciences, my mandate was to set up a stable isotope hydrology program. And fortunately for me, I had enough resources to set up a stable isotope lab, and students started joining the lab, and then the rest is history. At the Water Institute, as I said, my mandate was essentially to set up a program and do research. But I did enjoy teaching, so I did cover for, I think, Al Gihue, who was on sabbatical. And John Grace and I shared that course, so which sort of endeared me to the Department of Geology, but they found that I'll be a useful hand in teaching also. And then my research program was very successful. I set up the lab in record time, and although the original requirement was just to look at oxygen and hydrogen isotopes in water, but since I had experience in working on anything from meteorites to rock samples to paleoclimate and biogeochemistry, I designed, along with my students, a bunch of programs, and we worked on several aspects of stable isotope geochemistry. So we had a lot of scope to do a variety of research, and within years, a lot of PhD students were being produced, and many other PhD students working with Al Gihue and Tom Straw, Ron Chase, they all came and started using the lab, and they also benefited from the laboratory. So it became a very busy place, stable isotope lab. In Western,
in my capacity as first as a research associate and later as a faculty, my students and I have published about 50 papers, and in very top journals such as Science, Geochemical, Cosmochemical, Geophysical Research Letters, Applied Geochemistry. So essentially the topics have been very wide-ranging. Under my direct supervision, about 10 students have obtained their PhD, and about a dozen have obtained their masters. But as I said, many other students also use this facility. One of the things which I really like to share is the number of international students I have had. I had students from India, from Botswana, Ethiopia, and Canada, United Arab Emirates, and they're all doing pretty well, very well now. And some of them have gone back, and some of course stayed back, like my student from Cameroon, Elliot Atagwana, and he is a star today in the national scene. He's a professor at Oklahoma State University.
I was working at SUNY Buffalo for 2 years, and I got notice that a chairman position was advertised in Western Michigan University. And at the time, I knew a couple of colleagues here, Dr. Alan Kiwi and Bill Sack, and I knew them because they were had a project that was funded by the State Department doing work in Egypt on the hydrology of Egypt. And we've interacted a couple of times and so on. And I asked them more about the department, and the more I knew about it, the more I got interested in joining the department. And that's how I really got interested in applying for the job. And I was lucky enough to be chosen at the end of the day to come here. This is a different department in many ways, in ways that I really like very much. Since I came here, I was really impressed by the applied nature of the education that a student gets here, that you don't get in every place. And I see this as a very important asset to this department that sets it apart from the competition. I can see our students getting jobs before their colleagues from the ivory type of universities get it when they compete with them, just because they know how to do things and the other ones know about things but they don't know how to do them. We have very talented faculty here, have been with us for a long time, and some of them are now basically getting into retirement ages, and I want to say that many of them are getting there. So that's good news and bad news. So the bad news that we're losing very talented faculty here, but the good news is that we are going to be hopefully replacing them by very active young scientists that are going to come together at one time, covering many disciplines, and they're going to bring with them energy, synergy, new research projects, and a lot of things for our students, to work on and so on. So I see this department with these new hires going forward, not backwards. And as you probably know, this is the only ranked department from the STEM department across the campus by US News. So we have a very active research group here, and I wanna say that I hope, and I don't see why we cannot be the most active research unit on campus in the next 5 years.
In the hallway of the first floor of Rood Hall, there's a plaque that sits next to the sedimentation laboratory. And that plaque has the name W. David Kinsey on it. That plaque has been there for 39 years. So I seriously doubt if anybody or very few people watching this video have the foggiest idea who Dave Kinsey really was. But I do, because I think Dave probably is the one person in my life who had a greater influence on me than anybody else ever. Dave is a native of Seattle. Apparently he was an extremely good athlete in high school. I think I heard that he was actually an all-state fullback, and he went to Washington State University on a football scholarship. But he did earn his bachelor's and master's degrees at Washington State. He went to the University of Montana and began his PhD studies in 1979. And thankfully, I showed up the same year to begin my master's studies. And Dave and I were fast friends from the very get-go. And it was very, very easy to become a friend of Dave. We roomed together for 2 of the first 3 years we were in graduate school. And it was at that time that I think Dave probably turned my life around, quite frankly. When I went to graduate school, I wanted to just simply get a degree, get a job, and move on. Dave was full of enthusiasm. He was full of curiosity. He just exuded, basically, a desire to learn things. And he had this ability to carry other people along with him. And I was one of those people. And I credit Dave, basically, with putting me on the right career path to become what I actually ended up being. The one thing I gave back to Dave, I think, during those times is an occasion when I fixed him up with a lovely young co-ed by the name of Marilyn Maltz on a blind date. And as far as Dave is concerned, the rest is history. A marriage, 3 wonderful children. My part of the blind date didn't work out worth a darn. I lost track of Dave in 1964 because he came to Western and obviously became one of the founding members of this department. But for some reason, Dave wanted me in this department. And so he talked me into it, and I am basically here because Dave wanted me here. When I arrived, Dave was starting to deteriorate to some degree health-wise. And I think to everybody it was fairly obvious why. All through graduate school and through all the years that I had contacted Dave between when he left Montana and when I came to Western, he had a habit of working in the field wearing only shoes, short pants, and a hat. And that unfortunately did him in. He was still the same friendly, outgoing, totally brutally honest, hard-driving, students, you join me and we'll go together type of person, even as his health decided to decline. And Dave, very unfortunately, died prematurely at age 42. He is the spirit of this department. Dave brought a research drive into this department that not only I can see inspired others, but even those who already had that research drive when they came here were carried along by Dave. He was one of my gods.
I also worked with John Grace. John, a very witty man who passed away 2 years ago. His wife, Kelly, I believe, still lives here in Kalamazoo. John was a longtime advisor of our undergrads. He spent a lot of time with them. He was their advocate. He taught me how to be an advisor.
John Grace was a new guy, very proper British accent talking, and he was not a normal faculty person. John Grace always wore a sweater or something like that. He was one step above them as far as how he dressed when he was in class. So John was a nice model to have. Smart man, took econ geology from him, and he was my advisor on my thesis. So dearly liked that guy, and he was great for me.
John Grace taught mineralogy in this department for 30 years until he retired in 1996. We all remember that John had the best wit in the world. He would narrate the faculty roasts every year, and we would have slides, embarrassing slides about faculty members, and he would make them even more so, and we just loved him. He was so close to the students. He was the undergrad advisor for much of his career. And John, if you were feeling a little low, you just passed by John. He always had a smile, always cheered you up. We miss John since he retired in 1996, and especially, of course, since he died. But he made such a contribution that we all remember him so well. We thank you, John, for your contribution.
Betty Garrett was a crowning achiever in our department, and I'd like to briefly explain all those things that took place during her tenure here as a student in our department. I don't know at what point she started her education here at Western, but I know she was raising a family during most of the years while she was a student here. And I think she represents the ultimate example of a outstanding student in the non-traditional mode. Betty Garrett, along with her intense curiosity, her high energy, her great intelligence, was the most amazing, one of the most amazing persons I've ever met in my life. I'd just like to say that she also brought with her from Australia the snappy, high inquiry level of questioning things that went on in the classroom. Betty majored in geology here. She also had an incredible interest in archaeology, so I know she also majored in anthropology and may very well have majored in geography as well, because I know she had a good academic concentration there. She went on to achieve a bachelor's degree in geology, and I'm sure a bachelor's degree in anthropology. She earned a master's degree here. She earned a specialist degree here, and she earned a doctorate here at Western Michigan University. During her doctoral work, she focused on some of the very intense mineralogy and petrology that she learned as an undergraduate and as a graduate student. And she applied that after having spent many hours, I'm sure, with Dr. Chase interpreting thin section work. She applied that work to her interest in archaeology. And in this way, she was able to take pot shards and make thin sections of fragments of these items. She was able to interpret them based on mineralogy in terms of routes that were taken for the trade that went on in and amongst the Native Americans at that time. And of course, that was the basis of her doctoral work. And after she completed that aspect of her work, other archaeologists recognized the great value of what she had done. And at her location in Albuquerque, New Mexico, she was able to consult with many other archaeologists to help establish trade routes among Native Americans throughout the western U.S. And so that accomplishment was unique. No one else had ever done that. And so that just demonstrates the level of her capability. It demonstrated the level of her curiosity and interest in science. And I'm proud as can be of Betty Garrett.
Lauren was unique. She had so many good qualities. It's hard to imagine how well she fit into the program. First of all, Lauren actually was a student. She was enrolled in the master's program and did her master's thesis on using computerized well records to determine recharge and discharge areas in Kalamazoo County. So she was doing all of that at the same time she was directing the GEM program. The qualities that Lauren had were both personal and intellectual. First of all, she was the kind of person who could get people to work for her without any effort. People wanted to be around Lauren. The people in the whole GEM project came to love her. She could not only get people to want to do these things, but she had a way of being productive. She was very well organized, and she could set target dates for things like seminars and organize seminars and conferences. At the same time, she was producing materials, pamphlets, for example, pamphlets of general interest, technical pamphlets. So she was able to cross the line. She was, I guess what you would say is that she was just the perfect administrator for the program. So she was able to run a program where people were happy, they were comfortable, they were productive. There were no complaints about Lauren ever. And she had a serious side to her, though. That became clear to me at one time I was having breakfast with her. And I had always thought of Lauren as being a very easygoing, friendly kind of person. And for all of her easygoing nature, beneath that, she drew lines. And even more than I saw, she knew where to say enough is enough. And that was one of the beauties of her sort of management style, because she knew where to draw lines and get things done. She wasn't the kind of person who was just going to go on and on and on and try to please people. She had an interesting family life. Most people don't know that. But she was human like anyone else. And she had a sister and a daughter to worry about, a husband. So in spite of all of this that she was doing, she had her own personal and private life to deal with, which I think was not often, people thought of Lauren as being at Western all the time, and it really wasn't that way. So everyone missed her.